So we'll record this as well. So this is going to be the second demo of the day. The first one was objects. The second one is arrow function. So I'll just call this arrow.html. All right. And we'll bring in Bootstrap real quick. And we'll wire up a little JavaScript called arrow.js. And let's bring that in with the defer. Of course, it's in a different directory, so we're going to say /JS, arrow.js. And I'm just going to have just a simple submit button. Button type of submit and class of button primary. And we'll wire up an ID, button submit. Of course, dot on click. It's funny because we use an arrow function here, and we're going to break this down a little bit more. Okay, so we got a little arrow function starter. Let's use strict. Make the linter happier. And we have a button. And when we click the button, we call the console. Okay. So let's kind of go back to some stuff that we've already learned, which is how to declare a function. And if you remember right, we learned a little bit about arrow functions. I just want to dive a little deeper. We've kind of touched on arrow functions, I would say. But from what we've already learned, we learned something called a function declaration. That's one way to create a function. Function expression was the other. And now we have a third way, which is called an arrow function. And you know, if you want to get real fancy, call it an arrow function expression, which is a more condensed version of this function expression. Okay, so let's kind of start with the easiest way of creating a function in JavaScript, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people would agree, is with this syntax called the function declaration. And so I'll make a function called call me. What goes inside the parentheses is called the what? What goes inside these parentheses? Our inputs are called parameters. So remember that functions take inputs, and how many parameters can a function have? Many as you need. So rule of thumb is it could take 0 or many. 0 to many. So I could just make a function called call me and console.log hi person. And now instead of doing console.log, I'm going to call my function called call me. Okay, so when I click the button, we have this function that's going to be called. It takes no input parameters, and it just says hi person. Well, that's only as useful as you make it, because it's not very dynamic, but you can see it is working, right? We have now declared a function and we've called said function. Okay, and this is kind of going back a few chapters as far as how to, and we learned that the big benefit of creating functions is code reusability. Like we don't have to, we could call this function in many different places in our code. So we wouldn't have to rewrite that logic many times. You would just write it one time and then call it. But if we wanted to make this function more useful, maybe you could accept the person's name, right? Now, what goes inside this parenthesis, as we said earlier, this is called a parameter. Parameter is just a name for a variable. Okay, so name is just a variable. Now, I think it's kind of interesting because you don't say let name here. We're taught in JavaScript that when you declare a variable to always declare it with const or let, except for in the case of these special variables called parameters. We just have a person's name. Now, when you add this parameter, notice, well, you should. JavaScript is actually quite flexible because I didn't have to. That didn't break anything. That actually caught me by surprise because I would have expected that to break. I expected that to break. However, it didn't. But if you do this, right, if you provide a person's name, like, now I could supply an input to that variable. And instead of saying hi person, I'll go ahead and do a hi name. And now we might say call me and say this. And we supply different names. And now this method has an input, right? And we're reusing the function. Okay. So that's kind of where we started with functions, understanding that functions can take these optional inputs. Okay, in other languages, if you take an input, you have to provide an input. But notice there, I didn't provide an input, and it's still called the function. But that's not typical. Okay, you typically, for every input, you want to provide data going in. So, kind of going back to this, we call this the parameter. These values down here, these are called string literals. These are just strings that are coded into your source code. And you might hear that being called the argument, right? The data that is sent into the parameter is often called an argument. So just a little language difference there. Now also remember that a function, if you think of the parameters as inputs, let's remember that functions also have optional outputs, right? So you can send data into a function, but functions can also send data back out. Now, this function does not send any data back. Notice on lines 13 and 14, there's no data being sent to those lines. It's just doing something, and then you return to the next line 14, and then you run line 14 and it would go down to 15, and then the JavaScript is over, right? But notice this, the point is, this is not sending data back. What is the keyword that we learned to send data back to wherever you're calling? What keyword did we learn to send data back? Return. That's right. So just as a simple example of a function that returns something, let's say return, I don't know, let's return 15. Let me just return the number 15. For whatever reason, we're going to return 15. Well, notice now here, const number equals. Now I can assign a value equal to a function call. This number is going to be 15 because this function is sending back the number 15. And if I just, maybe I console.log number, it'll say hello Brad Gerstner, hello David Sachs, and then it should spit out our number 15, right? So just as functions can take inputs, 0 or many inputs, functions can take or can send data back, 0 or 1 piece of data back. So if I think as a function, functions have inputs. Functions can have 0 or many inputs, meaning data going into the function. Okay? Functions can have 0 or 1 output. That one piece of data going out. Now that one piece of data could be an object, for example, or an array or something else, right? Some complex piece of data. But at the end of the day, you can only return one piece of data. Okay, 0 or 1 outputs, 0 or many inputs. All right, and these are the basics of functions. Okay, now if I were to write this function differently, here's the same function written differently, and I'll build it up just like I did before. I'll say const call me equals new function actually let's we could just do function. Okay, you didn't need the keyword new. So this is a different syntax. Kind of what I wanted to do is kind of go back to a function with no inputs. So this is my function call me. JavaScript is different because what we're doing here is we're creating a variable called call me and storing a function in it. It's kind of weird, but kind of going back to what we had, console.log hi person, and then what did we do? We just said call me, and if we refresh, we gotta clear that out because we're not doing that anymore. Okay, so we get, this is the function expression syntax, which is a step towards how to create an arrow function expression. In order to create this arrow function expression, we have to understand this syntax. Now, what did we do? Well, we needed to, we had an input parameter, so here's now name. And if we want to do that, then we can kind of take this back. So if we have an input, we'll say hi name. Okay, and we can call this function just like we did before. Okay. So here, function expression, we have a little tour coming by. Wave at the tour. I don't know if they want me to talk to them. Nope, they don't. All right, see you later, guys. You see how I'm building this out the same way? And it's seemingly slow. I hope you're still with me. It's been a long day of coding. This is seemingly slow because this is necessary for your comprehension to understand kind of the build. Okay? At least it's necessary for my comprehension. Yep.
So, the difference between the two, is there really any too big of a point, or is it kind of preference?
Yeah, so remember what is the difference between the two, right? That's the question. And it comes down to this kind of concept of what's called function hoisting, which is the idea of where are the functions in scope. And so, like, where can you call the function from? This function syntax traditionally hoisted this function up into what was called global scope, and that created conflicts. If you had two functions with the same name, they would collide, and like JavaScript would break. So this syntax wouldn't do that hoisting, right? So this was kind of the preferred syntax because it wouldn't do that hoisting. Okay. I've seen it ebb and flow, go different ways. I write it more often this way, but certainly a lot of people still use this syntax. Just know that that kind of hoisting scenario could cause some conflicts, and if you're aware of that, then you just rename your functions, and there's workarounds. All right. So yeah, if I'm picking between the two, I'm leaning towards this syntax, even though it's a little bit more difficult. You can kind of read a little bit more on this hoisting functions on MDN, and that's the short version of it. Well, you would return a function, a value here, just the same way before. If I say return 15, then I can make a variable const number equals, and then let's console log number here. Let's format this. And now we have a function expression that takes one input and sends one piece of data back. I think line 19 is important to understand because it's like, hey, we have a function here. This function called callMe is sending data back to the event handler where it's being called, right? So because this function sends data back, we need to store that number. Now, it is flexible again, so you could do this, and then that number 15 is essentially lost. It gets sent back, but it never gets stored. So, it's not really being used in any useful way. But let's kind of show that. Let me launch this again. I got too many windows open. Okay, and so then we're doing kind of the same thing with this function expression syntax that's accepting an input and sending data back. Okay, so now we condense this down, right? So this arrow function expression, if you will, this arrow function is going to be a condensed version of this. And it looks like this. And kind of watch how this goes. Const callMe equals, instead of the keyword function, we just put the parameter. Name. Then we put an arrow. And if you have multiple statements, you need curlies. Console.log high name.
Real quick, what line does it call the console log high name on? When you declare the variable, or when you console log the number?
So if you follow the step-by-step, like if you put a breakpoint in, I'll put a breakpoint in, maybe that'll help. Okay. And you'll see it. So this is an arrow function. So let's just compare this to this. Okay, we haven't really condensed it down a whole lot. Like literally all we've done is replace the keyword function. We don't have the keyword function anymore, but notice what is name? Like I think that's kind of like the first step. Name is an input, right? This is an input parameter. So just recognizing that what's in these parentheses are your inputs, and you can still have multiple inputs. Okay? But this can still be condensed down from here. So you might argue, well, Mr. G, this function expression and this arrow syntax, it's not really any shorter. And, well, if you only have one statement, you can actually condense this down. So let me just do this. If that one statement is a return, this entire side of this arrow, like, if all I wanted to do in this function is return 15, okay, for an example, just how this can be condensed down even more, then you can actually at this point delete the curlies. And then you don't even need to have the keyword return, so you remove the keyword return now, and you just say 15. So this is a function called callMe that takes one input and has exactly one output. Okay, so some functions can be really condensed down, and like, okay, like let's make this a little bit more relevant, right? So I'll make this function called double. It takes an input number and returns number times 2. Number times 2. So these are the scenarios where it's not a complex function, but you can really see how it's just a much more condensed syntax. And if I go down here, double, and I say 15, and now we can just throw that in a console log. And let's console log double of 20. So this is a function. It takes one input. That input is a number, and it returns that number times 2. And if I kind of plop that open, F12 it, you can see 15 doubled is 30, 20 doubled is 40.
Could you use the document get element by ID and fill it in that way?
Yeah. Yeah, if I wanted to put this in my output, like P with an ID of output, and document get element by ID output dot.
No, I mean where the number times 2 is, put document get element ID, and the output put it as the parameter.
Let me just fire that up real quick. And that's not what you were asking though.
No.
Okay. See, there's 30 popping up on our output. What are you asking?
You know how you can put return the document get element ID?
Uh-huh.
Can you put that there and just shorthand it that way?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so yeah, so we wrote like a $sign function, right? So we wrote a function called const $sign equals this was called ID, and that returned document dot get element by ID, passing the ID here, right? And now we have written the $sign function in that kind of syntax.
Now I did find an error. It's something that's weird. You know the onClick function? If you would replace that with the $sign and you tried getting the event in the parentheses,
Yeah.
it wouldn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. It's also worth noting these parentheses right here. So these parentheses are interesting. There's some interesting rules around these. If you have only one input, you can actually remove those parentheses. Now my linter wants them on there, but so that's why I put them on there. But this is actually valid JavaScript. So if you have only one input, you actually don't need those parentheses. But if you have no inputs, you do need the parentheses. So I just always put the parentheses, right? I always put the parentheses. If you have none, or if you have many, you need the parentheses. But if you have exactly one, like again, exactly one input, that's actually valid.
Do you just separate it with a space, multiple parameters?
Commas.
Commas.
Yeah, parameters are separated with commas if you have multiple. So, like maybe this. Okay, so what if I want this? I want multiply. Okay, so I'm writing a function called multiply. I'm going to say input 1, comma, input 2. So I'm taking two inputs, and it's going to return input 1 times input 2. Right? So this is how we're going to have multiple inputs. We're going to separate them with commas. And I can do, now that I've got my $sign function written, I'll say $. I think I called it output. So output dot inner text equals multiply 5 and 2. 5 times 2 is going to be 10. So the result here is 5 times 2, which is 10. So this is useful when you're just returning a value. Like this really, really condensed syntax. It's useful when you're just returning a value. It's also worth, if you have multiple, like if you want your function to do more than just return a value, you still need the curlies here, right? You still need the curlies, and you do what you got to do inside your function. Okay, but if all your function does is return a value, you get this really great syntax that's really short. Okay. So that's really all I wanted to kind of expand on with this arrow function. These arrow functions are used quite a bit. I guess, yeah, there is still a function on the right-hand side here. It's a lot of times you'll hear me call them, it's an anonymous arrow function, right? It's a function without a name that you're ultimately storing in this variable called multiply. Okay.